Welcome to my YouTube channel, Pro Football GMRX. I'm your host, Roy Pickett. I will be providing you with my insights and opinions about choices and decisions that GMs face and make throughout the year. In this episode, I will be explaining the wide receivers and their value to their particular teams. This is not necessarily going to be a discussion on who is the best wide receiver in football, though I think this does create an argument for these individuals that I have selected. This is a synopsis of what it means for my opinion, a wide receiver, how much value he has for his particular roster. Uh, it'll be based upon how much the team throws, how many targets the receiver will get, how many yards he gets, based upon how many yards that the team gets as a entire entity and his contribution to the team. How many completions the team is awarded throughout the year, and how many receptions that player was able to come down with. To begin with, I looked at all of the team attempts, all the team's yardage, all the team's touchdowns, and all of their completions. And then I looked at the value that each player brought to their team in comparison. At the top of my list, I have DeAndre Hopkins. He had 1,572 yards receiving, and the team only had 3,781. So that's a huge proportion. His 115 receptions out of the 345 completions that the Texans had, again, was a large market share. 11 touchdowns and 163 targets was basically Deshaun Watson didn't have a whole lot of other options to go to when they were in a passing play, and so they threw the ball to DeAndre Hopkins. So that makes Hopkins a very irreplaceable player for the Houston Texans. Three things that I looked at as far as what a player does individually was how many yards did that receiver gain versus the team attempts. So in this particular instance, DeAndre had 1,572 yards, like I said, and the attempts was only 506. So that gives him about 3.11 yards per team attempt. That's pretty amazing when you consider everyone else in the league, including Julio Jones was 2.72 yards per team attempt. And that was probably watered down by the fact that Matt Ryan threw the ball 617 times and kind of took more opportunities to throw the ball, so it watered it down a little bit. Here in this column, I'm looking at the players' yards versus their receptions. So every time the catch is made, how many yards is that player responsible for? And here we look at Mike Evans. He was at 17 yards per catch, which was a pretty amazing number in and of itself. The last thing is how many times did the player make a catch and how many times was he targeted. Down here I have my prototype of what I'm looking for. I would like to see at least 75% of those targets be receptions. DeAndre Hopkins was at 71% and Tyreek Hill was at 70%. Michael Thomas was head and shoulders above everyone in this category. He had 96% of his targets were receptions on his part. Part of that could be because Drew Brees is so very accurate. Michael Thomas didn't have to go out of his way to make the catch if the ball was right in his hands. The next thing I'm looking at is the market share, and that's where I'm saying DeAndre Hopkins got 23% of the catches out of all of the team passing attempts. That's a pretty big number when you compare it to Davante Adams at 17%, Julio Jones at 18%. One of the surprising guys in this analysis was George Kittle, the tight end of San Francisco. He is basically my top 4 valuable receiver for his team, and he's a tight end. Part of that was due to the fact that Jimmy Garoppolo was hurt. They were playing with C.J. Beathard and Nate Mullins, they only threw the ball 532 times in Kyle Shanahan's offense. But out of those 537 attempts, 136 of those went towards George Kittle, and he was able to complete 88 of those catches. So that's why he's kind of up here on this list. I would love to have George Kittle on my team, have him be one of my featured receivers. This next market share look at is the touchdowns versus the team touchdowns passing. DeAndre Hopkins, with his 11 touchdowns and the Houston Texans only having 26 total touchdowns passing, counted for 42%. Davante Adams was at 52%. These are very high ratios of touchdown passes going to one individual. If I go down my list here, I can see that Zay Jones, who a lot of people think is horrible, up in Buffalo, had 54% of the touchdown catches from the Buffalo Bills quarterback. A lot of that was because of Josh Allen not being asked to throw the ball many times. He was only attempting, as a team, 499 team attempts, and they only had 2,794 yards, and they only had 13 team touchdowns. And you go, well, 7 of those 13 belong to Zay Jones, so he's going to get a lot of credit as far as being valuable to the Buffalo Bills last season. Another thing that I'm taking a look at is the yards and the team yardage. DeAndre Hopkins is way up here again at 42% of all of the yards that the Texans got throwing the ball. DeAndre was 42% of that market share. It's really elite level to be in the 30s, and he was at 42. Julio Jones was at 36%. George Kittle was at 36%. And Michael Thomas was at 35%. So you can see just how much DeAndre was worth to the Texans. Lastly, I have the receptions versus the team completions. Anything above like 27% is very good. DeAndre Hopkins was at 33%. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to take the player things, the yards per team attempts, the yards per reception, and the receptions per targets, and put that as a player factor. I just sum all of those things up, and I see that Mike Evans was pretty good in this situation. Just didn't matter if it was Fitzmagic or Winston throwing him the ball. He was at 20.8. DeAndre Hopkins 17.5. Julio Jones at 18.9, and Davante Adams at 18.2. I was really surprised to see Davante Adams this high until I started thinking about it. Aaron Rodgers, since he signed his big contract, they had to let go of some guys and backfill with some younger talent, whether it was Equanimeous St. Brown or Valdez Scantling or whoever. Aaron Rodgers just didn't have that kind of chemistry with those guys yet, so he went with the guy that he had chemistry with, and that was Davante Adams. So that's why he was so valuable to the Packers last season. Julio Jones comes in third, which is amazing because they had Mohamed Sanu, Calvin Ridley, and yet he was still carrying more than his fair share of the load. So that kind of goes over the player factors. The next thing is I'm looking at all of those market share things where you compare the player to his team, and I added up all of these percentages here in these blue columns. DeAndre Hopkins, if you add all those up, is 1.72. Adams was 1.57. Jones 1.31. So anything in the 1.3 and above is elite level top 10 wide receivers. And then I took these two things and multiplied them together to get my overall rank. So here are my top guys. DeAndre Hopkins, again, way up here at 30. And Adam Thielen was at the bottom of my elite level top 10 kind of guys, is at 20. So then my next tier of players is like Antonio Brown, Corey Davis, who didn't have many opportunities in Tennessee, but was the lion's share of those opportunities. Travis Kelce, Keenan Allen, Amari Cooper down here at number 14. Tyler Boyd up in Cincinnati on his rookie contract that I discussed in my previous video when I was discussing how much would I want to pay Amari Cooper versus trying to find me a rookie like Tyler Boyd. So Cooper's being paid $13 million, and he's looking for somewhere in the $19 million range, and Tyler Boyd's still on his rookie deal for $1.2 million. Kenny Galladay, Robert Woods, T.Y. Hilton, and Brandon Cooks is that second, the bottom of that second tier. Then I get down here to this third tier, and that's like overall ranking factor from 17.59 all the way down here to 13.47. And I think I could probably win if I had a couple of guys like this with George Kittle as my primary receiver. Who's in this grouping that we're looking at here? Juju Smith-Schuster, Zay Jones, as I discussed earlier, Odell Beckham Jr., Larry Fitzgerald, Zach Ertz, who I'm a big fan of, Jared Cook, another tight end, Stephon Diggs, Jarvis Landry, and D.D. Westbrook, and Courtland Sutton of the Denver Broncos. So imagine for my team that I'm wanting to be tight end heavy, if I could have had George Kittle and Zach Ertz and Travis Kelce, I'd be living large. Here is the bottom grouping of wide receivers that are still probably being passed off as being primary targets, or at least good number 2 wide receivers. And even though this is really talking real world, what I would like on a roster, you could utilize this information for your fantasy football team and say, who's that wide receiver 2 or wide receiver 3 that I want on my team. These are guys like Emmanuel Sanders, Sterling Shepard, Dante Moncrief, Calvin Ridley, Allen Robinson, Christian Kirk. Julian Edelman I have down here at 36, even though Josh McCown was famous for putting him in his top 5 wide receivers in the NFL when he recently broke onto ESPN as their analyst. And then Alshon Jeffrey is here at 12.37. Eric Ebron, and at the bottom of this list, in the top of the running backs considered, was Christian McCaffrey at 11.91. Even though Christian McCaffrey's number one responsibility isn't necessarily being a great pass catcher, he does allow Cam Newton the opportunity to maneuver the ball down the field with having this threat out of the backfield. So these are the numbers that I'm looking at. The bottom guys that I was kind of interested in comparing and seeing where they were. Tariq Cohen, he comes in at 40 right behind McCaffrey. DJ Moore, James White up in New England. He's kind of like a pass-catching specialist in the running back realm. Mohamed Sanu, Golden Tate, Adam Humphries. Cole Beasley's down here at 46. What did he do well? He was about 12% of the receptions per team attempts. So while he was in Dallas, they didn't have too many people to throw to, especially before Amari Cooper. So they were targeting Cole Beasley at a higher rate than probably he should have been. And the 75% is the receptions per player target. So at least when he was being thrown to, he was completing those passes and making them into receptions, which should be the case considering he's mostly a slot receiver with clear windows to the quarterback and generally short distance, which explains why he only had 672 yards receiving in completions. But again, these guys are all down here below, they're in the single digits, below 10. Who else do I have? I got Nelson Aguilar, Taylor Gabriel. Here we have Saquon Barkley and Alvin Kamara, which, again, they're running backs. They're not necessarily meant to be graded against wide receivers, but if I wanted to grade them against wide receivers, this is where they fall out. Michael Gallup, 8.72. I was very much a fan of his when he was being drafted in the 3rd round, so I wanted to see where he fell in line. I was really happy to see that Christian Kirk was way up here, right behind Calvin Ridley at 35. And then I got Austin Hooper at 56, Gallup at 51. So these are guys that I have like on my fictional football roster that I'm writing about in my book, and I discussed in a previous video. Quincy Enunwa was down here at 57. I don't personally value wide receivers as much as most of the league does. I'd rather go with tight ends that are good pass catchers, which is why I was excited about Kittle and Kelsey and Ertz up here. But this is just if I wanted to figure out who's the wide receiver I wanted to pay, whether it's DeAndre Hopkins or Michael Thomas or Amari Cooper, whoever's coming up on their next contract, I would compare them to, say, Brandon Cooks and where his contract was written, and maybe Keenan Allen, because he's here at number 13. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this video. If you have any questions, just leave something in the comments section. Please like this video, subscribe. I'm really excited about my book that's coming out here shortly, and just want to get my information out there to you, and hopefully you can use this on a fantasy football draft. Thank you. This concludes this video.